This is Don Rosa. When Don Rosa goes to a comic convention, he'll have maybe 3 or 4 people come to his table over the course of a weekend. Only 2 will even know who he is. At least, that's in the United States. In Europe, he's a superstar. He's on magazine covers, he's on morning news shows. Fans will wait 5 or 6 hours just to shake his hand. See, despite being an American artist, most of his work is out of print or hard to find in America. And in 2023, Disney made the shocking announcement that they will no longer allow some of his best and most beloved comics to ever be printed again in any country.
Now, I promise you this video is more than just anti-Disney rage bait. I'm not that desperate yet, but I wanted to find out, why has one of our country's greatest cartoonists not drawn a single cartoon in close to 20 years?
Why do Europeans love him when Americans barely know about him? And what does the Disney Corporation have against him? To find out, let's go back. Back to 1985, in Louisville, Kentucky. A local radio call-in show is airing. The topic? What do you regret most in life? The phone rings. The caller is Don Rosa, a 34-year-old Kentucky native. The show host even knows Rosa. He had come on the show before to answer callers' trivia questions about comics. But the Rosa who's on the phone is depressed. He confesses his greatest regret, that he has spent his whole life following his family's plans for him, and he never pursued his own dreams. And now, as he approaches middle age, he's finally accepted that those dreams are never going to come true. See, Rosa had wanted to draw comics, but it had been 3 years since he threw away his drawing supplies and exiled his drawing board to the basement.
Why? Well, Rosa's life was more or less decided for him before he was even born.
Rosa's grandfather had come to America from Italy and founded the Kino Rosa Tile Company in 1905. It had passed down through the generations, and everyone knew that eventually Don Rosa, the oldest male heir, would take over the company when he came of age. But there was another competing force acting on Rosa nearly from birth. He had a sister, 11 years older than him, who was obsessed with comics. And so, from the moment he arrived home from the hospital in 1951, he was surrounded by comic books. And the Rosa's favorite comics were the Donald Duck comics by Carl Barks.
Now, I have a whole video about Barks and his treatment by Disney, which I'll link at the end of this video, but here's all you need to know for now.
Barks had taken the simple, slapstick Donald Duck character from Disney's short cartoons and transformed him into the star of globe-trotting adventures, building out an entire cast of supporting characters, most famously Uncle Scrooge.
The only other thing you need to know about these is that they were hands down the best comics coming out of this time, so the Rosa siblings had excellent taste. But as Rosa grew up, his love of comics would clash with his family's plan for him.
From a young age, he would draw, telling his own stories, even redrawing his favorite Carl Barks comics, but he knew this could never be his career. So, after high school, his family decided that he would go to college to study civil engineering to meet potential clients of the construction firm he would soon inherit. Of course, on his first day on campus, he asked if he could draw cartoons for the school paper. The college wanted him to do something funny and political, but of course, Rosa made grand comic adventures in the style of Carl Barks, sometimes quite literally. Barks had made Lost in the Andes, so Rosa made Lost in an alternative part of the Andes. Rosa never took these too seriously, but it was a nice distraction from his civil engineering degree and his looming future in construction.
After college, he began working at the Kino Rosa company and life settled into a routine.
By day, he worked various jobs at the company, and by night, he dove deeper into comic fandom. He took over the Information Center, a column in the country's most popular comic fanzine, where he was effectively a human Google. Fans would write in their questions, and Rose would comb through his massive collection of comics, which had grown to over 30,000 issues, to find their answer. He could answer questions on anything from movies to TV shows to comics, but of course his favorite thing to research were Carl Barks Duck comics. A few years later, a local newspaper asked him to draw a weekly newspaper strip for their Sunday supplement. Rosa once again turned to Barks' adventure format, only this time he set it in and around Kentucky, featuring lots of Kentucky history and in-jokes in each installment. The paper only paid him $25 per issue, which could take him up to 15 hours to draw. But he didn't mind, this was just a fun, distracting hobby to take his mind off the drudgery of his day job.
But soon, life got in the way. He'd gotten older, he'd gotten married, he bought a house, he was taking on more responsibility at the construction company.
He was getting a little too old for his drawing hobby. And so the art supplies went in the trash, the drawing board went in the basement, and Don Rosa's superfan, Don Rosa the hobbyist cartoonist, became Don Rosa the construction manager.
And it wasn't just Rosa, but the entire comic world that was moving on.
Disney Comics had gone downhill after Barks retired and eventually stopped being published entirely. Superhero comics took over everything, and as the 80s progressed, they became grimmer and darker. Rosa still bought comics, but these grim superheroes didn't inspire the kind of joy in him that Barks' work did. And so we arrive in 1985, with Don Rosa pouring his heart out on the radio that, unfortunately, life just didn't work out his way. But, of course, he had no idea what would happen next. In August 1986, Don Rosa walked into his local comic shop and saw something unusual. This was the year of Watchmen, of Dark Knight Returns, but that wasn't what excited Rosa. No, he found a new Disney comic. Okay, new might be an exaggeration. It was a reprint of old Carl Barks stories, but whoever put it together knew their stuff. He looked into the publisher. They were called Gladstone Publishing, after Barks' character Gladstone Gander. After some digging, Rosa discovered that Gladstone wasn't much of a company at all, just 3 or 4 fans in Arizona who'd gotten the comic license from Disney because, by this point, nobody else wanted it.
Rosa even knew a couple of the guys from his days in the Duck fandom.
Naturally, Rosa became a collector of Gladstone's reprints, but then came the fateful issue that changed his life. Donald Duck, number 249. Between all the reprints, it included a brand new 10-page Duck story. Now, it wasn't the most polished story, it was clearly the work of a fan, but that struck Rosa like a lightning bolt. If Gladstone would publish other fans' works, maybe they would publish his. He picked up the phone and dialed the friend he had at Gladstone. He said if any person was born to write and draw a Carl Barks fan story, it was him. This was his manifest destiny.
Gladstone couldn't afford to pay much, but they agreed they'd publish a fan comic if he sent them one. Now he just needed to make it.
He recovered his drawing table from the basement and bought a new set of drawing supplies. He got out the rulers and templates from engineering college. This was his one chance to do a Duck story, and he was going to do it right. So while he worked in construction 5 days per week, for the other 2 days, it was Ducks. And he already knew the story he would tell. He had written it once already, in his college paper as Lost in an Alternative Part of the Andes. He had always had the Ducks in mind for that story, so now he just needed to refashion it into an official Duck adventure.
But then came the problem of actually drawing it.
Rosa wanted it to be perfect. Contributing a story to the canon of Duck comics was a dream come true, but he knew he wasn't the world's greatest artist. So, he got a stack of his favorite Carl Barks comics, brought them to the copy store, and began making copies. He cut up each photocopied issue and sorted it by character and expression or background, turning Barks' work into a personal reference library. For each panel he drew, he would lay out his references and get to work, meticulously measuring everything with his rulers and templates.
It was laborious work, and the money didn't really justify it. But this was just a hobby, and he was having fun. It took him nearly 6 months to finish the 26-page story, but finally, it was done.
As a finishing touch, he added the initials D-U-C-K, dedicated to Uncle Carl from Kino. Kino is Don Rosa's birth name. He mailed the story off to Arizona and waited. And waited. Finally, the story ran in Uncle Scrooge number 219. Of course, someone at Disney had pulled off his dedication to Carl Barks, concerned that it might be a signature. Disney artists were not allowed to sign their works. But that wasn't the point. Rosa had done it. He had contributed a story to the Duck canon, and he had done it in a way he could be proud of. He had fulfilled his childhood dream. He could return to his life as a construction manager, a happy man. But fate had other plans. Later that year, when the prestigious Harvey Award nominations were announced, there, under Best Single Issue, wedged between Watchmen number 9 and Love and Rockets number 23, was Don Rosa's Uncle Scrooge number 219. That's right, despite the general lack of interest in funny animals, Disney, and comedy comics, somehow Rosa had struck a nerve with his quote-unquote fan comic, and other professionals in the comic industry took notice.
Now, he didn't win the award, but the nomination itself was a sign that maybe he shouldn't be going back to construction right away.
Gladstone wanted more from Rosa, and so he had a decision to make. It may have been okay for a single story, but there wasn't really enough time for both construction and cartooning.
So, Don Rosa started doing some math.
He figured between the pathetic amount Gladstone was able to pay him, along with selling his original art pages off to collectors, he could make about half of what he made in construction. His wife was a teacher, and between the two of them, it would be just enough money to make ends meet. So he took the incredibly bold step and liquidated his grandfather's company, selling off nearly a century of his family's legacy so he could become a full-time comic book artist.
And so began one of the greatest periods of his life, and one of the greatest runs in comic book history. Now, soon, Disney's going to make Rosa's life very difficult, but before we get to that, let's actually take a look at these comics and see what makes them so wonderful.
Rosa's work can be difficult to analyze, in large part because of his repeated insistence that he's not even a professional, just a lucky fan paying tribute to Carl Barks. And yes, the comparisons to Barks are unavoidable and intended. Rosa would continue to add his D-U-C-K dedication to all of his comics, hiding it deep within the art where Disney wouldn't be able to find it and censor it.
But if Don Rosa were truly just a fan copying Carl Barks, I wouldn't be talking about him today.
Lots of artists have tried to imitate Barks, but only one of them is Don Rosa. I mean, there's a large contingent of fans who think Rosa's work is even superior to Barks' own. And Rosa's stories ultimately are very different from Barks's. What I believe is that Rosa fundamentally understood what made Barks' work so special, but he distilled that formula and then brought his own influences, interests, and personality to the stories, creating something equal to Barks, but also totally different.
So let's take a look at that Barks formula and the new ingredients that Rosa added.
The first thing Rosa extracted from Barks' stories is to draw on his own passions. Barks famously had little to no direction from his employers, and so he'd dream up stories based on whatever he was interested in. One month he wants to draw Viking ships, and so the Ducks go on a Viking adventure. He was a hobbyist inventor, so he added an inventor character to Duckburg. Rosa starts with the same approach, finding a nugget of his own interest, whether that's a movie, a piece of history, or a scientific principle, and builds a story up around that passion. It never feels like these stories are churned out for a paycheck, but artists simply sharing their hobbies with the masses. That brings us naturally to point number 2, which is a profound love for history and science. Barks famously had a large collection of National Geographic's magazines that served as the backbone of his research. It gives his stories this wonderful contrast. These wild duck antics were always grounded in a well-researched reality. Rosa, a fellow history buff, takes this a step further. Not only does he also have a huge collection of National Geographics, but each of his stories is subject to rigorous additional research in books and even consulting experts. There's an even stronger sense of history and reality, and arguably some real educational value too. And that brings us to the next point, which is a respect for the audience. All this historical research might seem silly for a kid's comic, but Barks had a policy to never talk down to the kids reading his comics, and Rosa, who was one of those kids, never talks down to his readers either. I hesitate to even call them kids' comics. Neither man was writing for a particular age group, they were just writing good stories that anyone could enjoy. It's the same thing that distinguishes Pixar or Ghibli from, like, Illumination or Paw Patrol.
Finally, Barks cared about these characters.
Of course, he'd created most of them, but he didn't shy away from exploring their emotions, and he wouldn't twist their characteristics out of shape just to serve his plots. And while Rosa tried not to create any characters, preferring to use Barks's, he continued that tradition of treating them like real characters with real personalities, not just stock heroes or villains.
Now, this brings us to Rosa's first major departure for Barks.
While Barks cared about these characters, he never gave much thought to continuity. Each of his stories existed more or less in a vacuum, with no elements or consequences carrying over, and many of his plot devices and supporting characters would appear only once and then disappear forever.
But Rosa, beyond his love of the Ducks, brought another influence to the mix, and perhaps it's a surprising one.
The Mort Weisinger era Superman comics. Weisinger was the editor of Superman through the end of the 60s and had brought a degree of continuity to them. It wasn't the rigorous, ongoing soap opera continuity of Marvel, but the simple idea that these stories connected, that characters and events and objects could pop up again and again, that Superman's world was real and interconnected. So Rosa began introducing this same linkage into the Duck universe. Old characters and objects would reappear, and the stories existed in an established timeline. Rosa's Duckburg starts to feel less like a setting and more like a real place that you could go and visit. His backgrounds were filled with details and callbacks to other stories, both Barks and his own. So let's talk about those backgrounds, because this is probably the most visually striking thing about Rosa's art, the product of another unusual influence: Mad. See, beyond the Ducks, Rosa grew up loving Mad Comics and Mad Magazine. One of Mad's greatest cartoonists was Will Elder, who was famous for filling every inch of his art with details and tiny gags that encouraged readers to pore over every page. As Rosa has said, he's never properly learned how to draw. He never learned how to be fast and efficient with a minimum use of lines. So instead, he makes up for this lack of ability by filling every inch of every page with lines, gags, and detail. I mean, every time you come across one of these half-page super detailed spreads is just such a treat. Now, this all looks very un-Disney. You could never animate this level of detail, but it's so strange and unique that it really works. You can almost feel Rosa hunched over his page for hours, just enjoying himself, drawing each person in a crowd, every brick in a building, or like Elder, stuffing the background full of silly gags.
And that's the final thing that I think Rosa really brings to the Duck comics. It's his absolute devotion to the gag.
Barks was a funny writer and loved a good gag, but Rosa just cranks everything to 11, going out of his way at every opportunity for a pun, a joke, or just some visual madness. But through it all, Rosa's stories are tight and efficient, but never predictable. You can tell he worked and reworked every panel to perfection. You can almost feel his joy on every page. This is a guy in the process of living out his greatest dream, smiling over his drawing board, and his enthusiasm is contagious.
I'll put links in the description and talk about what's happening with the books in a minute, but what matters now is that Rosa's work was having an impact. He was reviving America's interest in Duck comics and Disney, but soon that very success would have dire consequences. With the help of Rosa's wonderful stories, Gladstone's Disney comics were making a comeback. But after about 2 years, red flags from Disney corporate started popping up.
Disney had decided they wanted to approve Rosa's scripts before he drew them. Now, Disney had never cared much about their comic business. They had always just licensed the characters out to one publisher or another and let them do their thing. That was how Barks had been able to build so much of his Duck universe without Disney's interference.
But now with Rosa, Disney was suddenly intruding, and it was clear they didn't know what they were talking about.
They made comments like ducks were talking but their beaks were closed, despite 40 years of ducks talking with their beaks closed. It all seemed suspicious to Rosa. He theorized that now that Gladstone had finally turned Disney Comics into a successful business, Disney wanted the license back. But they couldn't just break their contract, so instead they were going to make Gladstone's life as difficult as possible.
For Rosa personally, that meant that the other shoe was about to fall.
On a routine call with Gladstone, they mentioned that Disney said that they could no longer return Rosa's original art back to him. Rosa was flabbergasted. This was no small thing. Fully half of the money he made was from selling that original art. Gladstone's pay alone was not enough to live on. But beyond that, he knew that Disney had no right to his art. Gladstone was only paying him for the right to use it, and Disney wasn't paying him or Gladstone anything. But Disney knew that. They didn't want to steal his art and sell it. They weren't Marvel. They just wanted to stop him from selling it. Well, Rosa couldn't tolerate that. He was a man of principle, and so, after just 2 years and just over 20 stories, he quit his dream job.
Unfortunately, Rosa's principles put him in a bad financial jam.
He had liquidated his family's century-old construction business, he had no interest in drawing comics that weren't ducks, and he refused to work at Disney if they were going to steal his artwork. He was able to convince a few former employees of his construction company to hire him at minimum wage to estimate construction jobs, but it wasn't going to cover his bills. Now, he was aware that there were publishers in Europe making duck comics, so he sent his work to the Dutch duck publisher, who hired him to do a few stories. But the Dutch didn't like how strange and un-Disney his drawings were. They made him redraw the ducks on the work he submitted, and it was clear there would be no steady work there. At one point earlier, he had been offered to work on DuckTales, a loose TV adaptation of Barks' Duck Adventures that Rosa considered to be a knockoff, but he had passed on it to focus on his comics. Now, in desperation, he called him back, but he was too late. DuckTales was already off the air. But they were working on a new show called Tailspin and offered him a job writing that. Rosa ended up writing 2 episodes of Tailspin, but he soon realized it wasn't a good fit. His passion was for comics, and he just didn't have the same passion for TV animation. By this point, Disney had finally succeeded in wresting the comic license back from Gladstone and tried to convince Rosa to come back and work for them, but even with his difficult financial situation, he still refused to work for them.
Things were grim, but Rosa had one more shot.
He had learned that the largest publisher of duck comics in Europe was Egmont. They're based in Denmark, but publish their comics in multiple languages throughout Europe. Rosa couldn't afford a long-distance phone call, so with no other options, he sent a telegram to their office and waited for a response.
Once again, he had no idea what would happen next.
A few days later, the phone rang in Rosa's Kentucky home. The woman on the other end said she was calling from Copenhagen. She said her name was Nancy Dejgaard and she worked at Egmont, and she wanted to hire Don Rosa to do duck stories for them. He asked her if they would return his art. She said no one had asked before, but of course they would. He asked what kind of stories they wanted. Any kind he liked to draw. How much did he want to be paid, she wanted to know. He gave her the number Gladstone was paying and then revised it and quoted an actual fair amount that real American comic publishers paid. She offered him double. What was going on here? Well, it turns out there are a few things even Don Rosa didn't know about duck comics. The first was Disney's licensing policy. See, when an artist anywhere on the planet created a story for one of Disney's licensors, any of Disney's other licensors were allowed to reprint it. Of course, the artist wouldn't be notified or paid any royalties, don't be ridiculous. So not only did Egmont know who Rosa was, they had been printing his stories for the past few years and their readers loved his work. When they called him, they were just hoping he wouldn't ask for too much money. But he had even more to learn. In 1991, Egmont paid for Rosa to come to Europe for the first time. This man who'd never even been to Canada was in for quite a shock. While the duck comics had faded from the US landscape in the late 60s and disappeared entirely by the 80s, Europe had never stopped printing them. In America, the name Carl Barks had been forgotten by all but a few aging fans. But here in Norway, 1 out of every 4 people read the weekly Donald Duck comic.
Not only was the Donald Duck comic their best-selling comic, it was the best-selling periodical in the whole country.
As Egmont brought him around Europe, he was astonished to find country after country in love with the ducks. And not just Donald Duck, the Disneyland mascot, but the whole duck family as Carl Barks had created them. Comic shops would have entire walls filled with duck comics. He had thought he was the last of a breed, one of a few hardcore fans trying to keep alive the dimming flame of Carl Barks. But here in Europe, he realized there were hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who shared his passion.
And not only that, but to them, Don Rosa was a celebrity.
His fan art had made him one of the most beloved cartoonists in Europe, just nobody had bothered to tell him. And so began a period of great happiness in Rosa's life. Egmont continued to buy his stories and pay him well. He could afford to put great detail and time into each story, and he continued to grow as an artist and writer. And they would fly him to Europe multiple times a year where he was greeted as a hero.
Of course, Disney soon destroyed the comic book publishing business they'd taken over from Gladstone, planning an aggressive expansion before collapsing into just 3 titles.
So this is so weird. Even though Rosa wrote his scripts in English and his work was being published across Europe, he couldn't even read it.
Eventually, months or sometimes years later, Disney of America would get around to reprinting Don Rosa's stories in the US, because they could do so without paying him. But their mismanagement of the brand had driven away all interest in Disney comics by this point. But one good thing did come from Disney's attempt at comics.
Before their implosion, an executive had called Rosa up and said they wanted to do a 12-part maxi series that told the origin story of Uncle Scrooge, and they thought he was the right guy for the job. Good idea. Would they return his art? Of course not. He said no thanks, but he did share the idea with Egmont. They agreed he could do the series for them, and they'd pay him well and return his art. And at the end of the day, Disney US would still get the series for free, so that might have been their plan all along anyway. Whatever the case, Don Rosa was about to begin on his opus. With The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck, Rosa set out to make the ultimate Carl Barks fan work. He would take every offhand remark Barks had made in any of his stories, catalog them, and create a coherent story telling how young Scrooge McDuck became the richest duck in the world. Now, this whole idea is incredibly unique. Duck stories generally topped out at less than 30 pages, but here was one that was over 200, and it was a human story, a coming-of-age story about one of the major figures of global pop culture. Now, The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck should really have limited appeal. There's so much minutia in the references. This was Rosa working to please himself and his fellow Barks fans. It's loaded with in-jokes only they would get. But this was not just the work of Rosa the Human Comic Index, but also Rosa the writer and artist at the peak of his powers. Every page is filled with passion, with effort, with a man working to honor his inspiration and top himself at every turn. Fans loved it. They were captivated by that passion, by the humor, by the epic scope. Some people even consider it the best duck story ever written. Of course, this was all happening in Europe, where they loved ducks and understood their history. How would it be received in the US? Well, in 1995, when Disney finally bothered to publish it here, fans embraced it. Even fans who had no idea about the ducks and their history were won over by Rosa's storytelling. And then, to take things one step further, Rosa won the Eisner Award for Best Serialized Story of the Year. Somehow, Rosa had reached out to readers of all types in a country which had lost any fondness for funny animal comics and created something with mass appeal. After Life and Times, Rosa's fame continued to grow. Still mainly in Europe, since Disney still didn't have their publishing act together in the US. Rosa himself became something like an unofficial Disney ambassador, traveling around Europe, appearing anywhere and everywhere he was asked, spreading his love for Barks' duck comics, even if by this point there were just as many fans of his own work. And even if he is deprecating towards his own work, it's clear that Rosa does love these fans. He makes a point to respond to every fan letter, and he never charges for signatures or sketches. Of course, this was taking a toll on his earnings, because less popular artists were home drawing stories and getting paid for them, while he was out here doing all of this for free. Still, this was a man living out his fondest dream. But there was something bothering Don Rosa, and it was only growing as the years wore on. It started with assumptions fans were making. European fans, seeing his fame, assumed he was rich. Interviewers would joke about his millions of dollars. Now, he knew Disney didn't pay royalties to artists. That's what he'd signed up for. But he began to feel foolish, like he'd been swindled, that perhaps this big corporation had used his very love and enthusiasm for Barks' work to manipulate him. Here he was selling Disney around the globe, yet neither he nor Barks nor any artist was financially benefiting from it. As time passed, he realized the enormity of this exploitation. New books would be released in various countries reprinting his older work, proudly putting his name on the cover, and not only would he not get paid, they wouldn't even tell him. Finally, upon the announcement of a new series to be called Don Rosa #1, it became too much to bear. His very name had become a brand that the Disney Corporation was exploiting around the world, and he was tired of it. In an attempt to gain some compensation, he filed a trademark in the EU for his own name. He didn't even want royalties, just an annual fee for the use of his name and some free copies, an ability to prove the material because he was tired of shoddy work bearing his name. While Egmont continued to treat him fairly, the rest of the publishers refused. They would simply remove his name and publish his work anonymously. On top of all of this, Rosa's eyesight, which had always been bad, was getting worse. His enthusiasm for his work had helped him overcome his eyesight difficulties, even when he had to put his nose right up against the paper to draw, but the Disney system had finally run his enthusiasm dry. Or as Rosa himself put it, "They broke my spirit." And so, once again, Rosa made a dramatic decision to stick to his principles. He sold off 15,000 comics from his collection to pay off his mortgage so he could afford to quit working for Disney. That's right, in 2006, the final Don Rosa Duck comic was published. He had no interest in doing comics without the ducks, so for the past 18 years, one of America's finest comic storytellers hasn't told a single story. And it seems like Disney hasn't forgiven him for that. In February of 2023, Disney quietly announced that they would no longer allow anyone to print 2 of Don Rosa's stories because of the racist depictions they contain. Now, this is a difficult issue. Rosa was reusing racist characters and plot elements from Barks' comics. And while I won't defend that decision, there's something odd about this whole situation I have to point out. Disney's policy has generally been to put content warnings before films and comics with similar harmful depictions. I mean, this is how these very same characters continue to be handled in reprints of Carl Barks' work. But Rosa gets a different treatment. Instead of a content warning, Disney has barred anyone on Earth from reprinting 2 of his stories. And one of those stories is the climactic chapter of The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck. Rosa's opus, his masterpiece, one of the greatest comics of the 90s, will never be printed again. I can't help but feel this is some kind of petty revenge, an attempt to erase the legacy of a man who was once one of Disney's greatest supporters as punishment for daring to stand up against the way they treat their artists. Now, of course, he hasn't stopped talking to fans or stopped being a fan of Barks and the Ducks. He still travels the world, does sketches, and responds to fan mail, but now he devotes more of his time to growing the chili peppers that he hands out to fans at signings. But I can't help but be sad that this man, who loved the Ducks so much, who loved Carl Barks so much, who shrugged off his family's legacy so he could pursue his dreams, and who became one of the most beloved cartoonists of his generation, has been treated so poorly in return. As he said himself in his autobiography, "I'll forever be bitterly sorry that the system finally crushed my enthusiasm for my greatest love." But that's life.
Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're in America, hopefully you can still find some of Fantagraphics' beautiful reprints of Rosa's work, although many volumes are out of print and exorbitantly expensive, and some will likely remain out of print forever. I'll put a full reading guide and purchasing guide down below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help out. My huge thanks go out to Jano Rodler, who runs Don Rosa's Facebook page and was helpful in the research of this video. If you haven't seen my Carl Barks video, you can check that one out here. And if you want another video about a Carl Barks fan who changed comics forever, you can watch my Jeff Smith video here. Thanks so much, and I'll see you soon.